The Indian Councils Act of 1861 and 1892. It's a new topic. We'll cover it from the political science perspective mainly, and from college level viewpoint, and but you can also use the text, the topic content for any exam to answer any type of questions related to this topic, whether it's in a school, college, or an competitive exam like UPSC. You can write answer from this text. This is sourced from trusted resources and books. Okay, let's start. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 and 1892 represent the foundational, albeit tentative, steps in the constitutional evolution of British India. From a political science perspective, these acts were not designed to democratize Indian governance, governance, but to serve the colonial state's twin objectives of administrative efficiency and the managed incorporation of a loyal Indian elite into the advisory machinery. They established the initial architecture of a quasi-legislative system, creating a platform that Indian nationalists would later exploit to demand greater political power, thereby setting in motion a process of constitutional reform that would eventually outgrow its colonial design. First, the Indian Council Act of 1861, a foundational blueprint for authoritarian incorporation. A historical and political context, the shadow of 1857. Post-revolt reorganization, the 1857 revolt served as a profound shock to the British imperial system, leading to the dissolution of East India Company and the direct assumption of governance by the British Crown under the Government of India Act 1858. The primary political objective was to prevent future uprising by consolidating control. The centralization-decentralization paradox. The revolt revealed the dangers of rigid, overly centralized administration that was alienated from local conditions. The 1861 Act was a strategic response. It decentralized the process of legislation to strengthen the reality of central control. By involving locals in an advisory capacity, the Raj aimed to gather intelligence, lend legitimacy to its rule, and create a class of collaborators. Key provisions and their constitutional significance. Establishment of legislative councils. The Act mandated the creation of legislative council for the Governor General at the center and for the governors of Bombay and Madras. Significance. This formally institutionalized a separate legislative function distinct from the executive, through the separation remained largely theoretical as the consecutive completely dominated the councils. Introduction of the portfolio system. The Act introduced the portfolio system within the Governor General's Executive Council, whereby individual members were assigned specific departments, that is, home, finance, and law. Political science analysis. This was a critical administrative innovation. It established the principle of specialization within the executive and is widely regarded as the protoform of the modern cabinet system in India. However, these councillors were responsible solely to the Governor General, not to any legislative body, thus embodying an autocratic, not democratic executive model. Nomination of non-official Indian members. The Act authorized the Governor General to nominate between 6 to 12 additional members to the Central Legislative Council for a 2-year term. Crucially, some of these were to be non officials, and for the first time, Indians were included in this category. Nature of nomination. The selected Indians were not representatives of the people but were carefully chosen from among loyal princes, zamindars, that is landlords, and wealthy merchants. Their role was to provide a native perspective and lend a veneer of legitimacy, not to legislate. Significance. This marked the first hesitant incorporation of Indians into the highest lawmaking process, establishing the principle of association, however, unrepresentative and powerless. Legislative decentralization. The Act restored the legislative powers that had been withdrawn from the presidencies of Bombay and Madras by the Charter Act of 1833. Significance. This was a recognition of India's regional diversity and the impracticality of total centralization. It planted a seed of federalism, albeit one entirely controlled by the imperial executive. Limitations and colonial intent. Viceroy's absolute authority. The viceroy possessed ultimate power. He could veto any bill, promulgate ordinances, and certify any rejected bill as law if he deemed it essential for public safety. Purely advisory role. The councils could only discuss matters referred to them by the Governor General. Members had no power to debate the budget, table resolution, or exercise any control over the executive. Objective. The Act's fundamental goal was to administrative efficiency and political control, not democratic empowerment. It was a classical tool of colonial states seeking to co-opt elite dissent and improve governance without ceding power. Source integration. The intent and structure of the 1861 Act are analyzed in Mithi Mukherjee's in India's In the Shadows of Empire, a legal and political history, 1757 to 1950, which argues that such act created a legal framework for a despotic state. The administrative history is detailed in B.B. Mishra's The Bureaucracy in India, an historical analysis. The perspective of the imperial government is found in primary documents like Report on the Indian Council Act of 1861 contained in the British Parliamentary Papers. Okay, these are the resources. All resources I have mentioned related to all the particular subparts of this PDF. In case you need this PDF to read apart from the video screen, you can mention in the comment. I will provide the PDF from the Telegram channel of mine, which is Rishabh Meme wrote. Okay, the intent and structure of the 1861 Act are analyzed in Mithi Mukherjee's India's In the Shadow of. Okay, this is done. The Indian Council Act of 1892, the managed concession and the genesis of electoral politics, a historical and political context, the nationalist impulse, the rise of organized nationalism. The period between 1861 and 1892 witnessed the emergence of the Indian National Congress 1885 and a politically articulate educated middle class. The moderate leaders of the early Congress such as Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale began a sustained campaign for political reform. Constitutional agitation, their strategy was one of prayer and petition, and the central demand was the reforms and expansion of the Legislative Council to include elected Indian representatives with real powers. Key provisions and their constitutional significance. Increase in size. The Act expanded the number of additional members in both the central and provincial legislative councils. Significance. While the numbers remained small, this expansion acknowledged the growing pressure for Indian participation and allowed for slightly wider through to still elite circle of involvement. Introduction of the principle of indirect election. This was the Act's most revolutionary feature, while it stopped in short of while it stopped short of instituting direct elections. It permitted a system of nomination based on the recommendation of specific public bodies. Mechanism. Local institutions such as municipalities, district boards, universities, and chambers of commerce were empowered to recommend individuals for membership. The Governor General then formally nominated this individual. Political science analysis. This was a seminal moment. It marked the first, albeit indirect, acknowledgement of the electoral principle in Indian politics. It created a functional, if heavily managed, link between the Legislative Council and certain sections of the Indian populace, moving from pure nomination towards a rudimentary form of representation. Enhanced yet limited functions. Members gained the right to discuss the annual budget and to ask questions on matters of public interest, subject to prior notice and restrictions on topics like foreign policy and princely states. Critical limitations. They could not ask for supplementary questions, move resolutions on the budget, or vote on its provisions. Their power was confined to discussion and interrogation. Significance. This established a platform for a legitimate public critique of government policy, particularly its finances. It led to the It laid the groundwork for the principle of executive accountability to the legislature, a cornerstone of parliamentary democracy that would be fought for and expanded in subsequent decades. C. Limitations and continued colonial control. The official majority was meticulously retained at the central legislative, ensuring the viceroy's proposals could never be defeated. The reforms were a classic colonial tactic, offering a minimal concession to moderate nationalist demands without transferring any real power, thereby aiming to strengthen the hand of the loyal moderates against more radical elements. Source integration. The nationalist demand on the British response are chronicled in Bipin Chandra's The Rise and Growth of Economic Nationalism in India, which details the moderate agenda. The constitutional evolution is traced by M.V. Pyle's Constitutional History of India and Granville's Austin's The Indian Constitution Cornerstones of a Nation, which often begin their narratives with these early acts. The British perspective and the limitations of the reforms are evident in the writings of the Cambridge School, particularly in Anil Seal's The Emergence of Indian Nationalism, which views these acts as tools for managing elite competition. Comparative analysis and long term impact, a political science evaluation. Feature Indian Councils Act 1861, Indian Council Acts 1892. Nature of membership, purely nomination, indirect election via recommendation. Principle introduced Association of Indians representation in a limited indirect form. Function of councils, purely advisory on matters referred by GG could discuss the budget and ask questions. Official majority maintained at the center. Maintained at the center. Primary intent, administrative efficiency. Post 1857 consolidation managed concession to moderate nationalist demand. Long-term impact and significance. A political training ground, these councils, for all their weaknesses, functioned as a crucial school of democracy for the first generation of Indian political leaders. Figures like Gopal Krishna Gokhale honed their skills in parliamentary procedure and public financier, skills that would later be deployed in a more robust legislative setting. Platform for ideological contestation. The councils provided a legitimate public platform from which the foundational critiques of colonialism, most notably the drain of wealth theory, could be articulated and entered into the official record, amplifying their reach and impact. The inexorable logic of reform. By establishing a precedent for constitutional change, these acts initiated a process that Indian nationalists would relentlessly push forward. Each subsequent reform, 1909, 1919, 1935, was a response to the inadequacies of the previous one, creating a slippery slope that ultimately led to the demand for full responsible government, institutionalizing a political trajectory. The Acts of 1861 and 1892 began the process of creating a centralized parliamentary style polity for India, an institutional part that would heavily influence the design of the Indian Republic's constitution in 1950. In conclusion, the Indian Councils Act of 1861-1892 were not democratic instruments but tools of colonial management. However, by inadvertently creating a space for Indian political participation and establishing the principles of representation and executive accountability, they laid the indispensable, if deeply flawed, constitutional foundation upon which the edifice of Indian democracy would eventually be built. That's it for today. This topic is completed. You can see it twice or read it for better preparation. Thanks.